pleasure to welcome you on behalf of the ISRF, which stands for Independent Social Research Foundation. Thank you very much for joining us today for this book launch event in which we're going to discuss and celebrate the recent publication of Dr Seb Rumsby's new book, Development in Spirit, Religious Transformation and Everyday Politics in Vietnam's Highlands. My name is Dr Nicholson and I will be chairing tonight's book launch. I'm going to open with a few brief introductory remarks about the book and about Seb's relationship to the ISRF. I'm then going to introduce and hand over to Seb, after which we will hear from our two panelists today, Maya Nguyen Emma Tomalin, although I think we're going to do it in the opposite order, so Emma's going to be speaking first. I'm going to introduce each of them in turn. We'll then give Seb the opportunity to respond to their questions, and after that we'll have plenty of time for questions from the audience. And after that, once we've finished around 7:30, there'll be some drinks and some nibbles in the courtyard. For those of you who don't know us, the ISRF is a small independent research funder that supports individual researchers to complete research that is critical, innovative, interdisciplinary, and oriented towards real-world problems. Although its remit encompasses the social sciences and humanities broadly construed, the Foundation has a special interest in political economy, but only if it's practiced critically, rigorously, and with regard for the lived experiences of those people whose actions it takes as its subject matter. Now, Seb was one of our independent scholar fellows between 2021 and 2022, and for his ISRF project, he undertook an ethnographic study of the everyday political economy of undocumented Vietnamese migrants in the UK, and he's also continuing to do that research currently as a Live Hume Fellow at Birmingham. And hopefully we'll be able to chat a little bit more about that research and how it fits into the book that we're discussing. So although the ISRF did not fund the research that went into tonight's book, in many ways the book exemplifies the kind of research that the ISRF seeks to support. And it also shows why Seb's work fits so well with the ISRF. It is, above all, a rigorous study of the everyday economic, religious, and social practices of a number of marginalised communities in the northern Vietnamese highlands. It's truly interdisciplinary, effortlessly weaving together critical political economy, historical analysis, ethnographic study, and theory building. And it's deeply critical and reflexive in outlook, both drawing upon and pushing at the boundaries of feminist political economy. And the result is a very engaging and very interesting book that is not only instructive, but also very nicely written and easy to follow. What stands out for me about the book is that throughout it, Seb prioritizes the lived experiences of his interviewees. He shows that to study and understand political economic shifts, we can't just focus on political or governmental policies or on abstract data and figures. It requires close, respectful, and detailed engagement with the way people in communities have actually positioned themselves in relation to the state, to wider markets, as well as to each other. And it's in this spirit that Seb explores, as he puts it himself in the book, the ways, quote, in which capitalist expansion into the highlands is felt at the everyday level. This is a methodology that brings political economy to life, but it also makes real life a subject of political economic study. Now, the upshot of all of this is not only that Seb's book is empirically rich and insightful, but also that he is able to avoid trading in what are, at best, hasty generalizations, and at worst, stereotyped portrayals of the communities that he studied. And instead, Seb offers a sensitive and detailed analysis that takes account of the myriad complexities of his case studies. His conclusions are also modest and measured and explicitly warn against either over-interpreting or uncritically celebrating the form of unplanned development that the book maps so nicely. Now, this marks the 28th ISRF book launch and the first of what we like to call in the team the fourth season of book launches. And each of these book launches has been a huge success because of the brilliant contributions of the speakers and our panelists. So I just wanted to express our gratitude to all three of you for being here today. Okay, now I'm going to introduce Seb and hand over to him. Dr Seb Rumsby is a Labour Hume Early Career Fellow in the School of Social Policy at the University of Birmingham. As I mentioned, he was an ISRF Independent Scholar Fellow between 2021 and 2022, and before that he completed his PhD at the University of Warwick. His research interests include everyday politics, labour exploitation, undocumented migration, ethno-religious politics, grassroots development, and non-national histories. He has published several academic articles in the past few years, many of which will likely be of interest to our audience tonight. And one of these includes a co-authored piece with Jennifer Philippa Eggert, which speaks to the religious positionality of ethnographic researchers that I thought speaks nicely to the book as well. So it's a great pleasure to have you with us this evening. Over to you.
It's great to see you all here. Thanks for coming along and joining this celebration. It's been a long journey to get to this point. And I've got Chris representing Warwick, where I did my PhD, and I've got my dad here as well, representing my family, who've put up with a lot while I've been doing this as well. So thank you all. And yeah, just for a few minutes, I wanted to kind of just mention the kind of reason for this book, really, and it kind of came out of this kind of interest in a very unique phenomenon that happened in Vietnam's highlands in the kind of mid-80s, mid to late 80s and early 90s, where huge numbers of these Hmong people, a marginalised ethnic minority group in Vietnam, started converting to Protestant Christianity, kind of seemingly out of the blue. There was no missionaries physically present there, and instead the catalyst came from an evangelical radio broadcasting station. So it's a kind of strange thing, and among other things, what it really did was highlight the agency of local people in this process of religious transformation, as opposed to a lot of the way that kind of religious transformation is usually analysed through the kind of impact of foreign, usually Western missionaries and that kind of relationships with power and all of that. This was different and interesting and showed something of the agency of local people. But what happened next? That's really what I wanted to ask and talk about in this book. You know, how did religious transformation intersect with other kind of political and economic processes that were happening at the time and are still carrying on in this rural, kind of remote area of a rapidly developing country? And to what extent could religious transformation or conversion be seen as empowering for this, or for certain elements of this marginalised community? So this is the kind of front cover picture that I chose for this book. It's a lovely photo. I didn't take it. It's a skilled photographer called Nguyen Emma, who's a friend of a friend, and when I saw it, I asked if I could use it. And you might notice in the book that they edited out a bit of it because they needed space to write the development in spirit, but I actually quite like that there's got this photo of the nativity scene. So it's a Christmas festival going on. And the reason I liked it, and I thought it spoke to my book, was for three things. Firstly, there's this contrast between the traditional Hmong costumes or clothing that you can see mainly the women wearing on this side. It's a bit like my one. This was given to me as a gift, by the way, from people in my research community. And so you've got this contrast between the traditional and the modern, or the kind of Western influence of Christianity. And this is one of the dynamics that comes out in my book, where you have these people embracing this strange foreign religion and in a sense rejecting certain or undermining certain aspects of traditional Hmong spirituality and social norms. But at the same time, it's not that simple, because Christianity also kind of promotes certain aspects of the Hmong ethnic identity. For example, linguistically, the Hmong Bible means that loads and loads of Hmong people are learning to read and write Hmong in a context where other minority languages are dying out. So that's one thing that's going on in this photo. Another obvious thing that's going on in the photo are the gender or family dynamics, where you have the men at the back kind of putting the contributions of sweets into this big bag, while the women are kind of distributing it out on the floor, their Christmas present for the kids. And this was another kind of theme that came out in my research to do with the gendered nature of Christian conversion or religious transformation, where the men are still the ones who are leading churches, preaching the religious orthodoxy. However, really, women are at the forefront in terms of church participation. They are much more likely to participate in religious activities. Female-led conversion of the family was a common phenomenon, and that's another thing that I talk about in my book, Christianity and how it relates to patriarchal structures. The third thing that this book kind of touches on is the kind of relation to the increasingly marketized and commercialized nature of everyday life, where you've got all these sweets in their wrappers produced by factories and companies in other parts of the world, and how there are these Christian conversion has kind of come at the same time and accompanied drastic changes in everyday Hmong lifestyles, from a traditional kind of semi-subsistence lifestyle where most or a lot of their kind of needs were produced at home or you know, based on very kind of local market transactions, to being kind of integrated into this national or international market economy where new habits and desires for consumption are formed. And how does Christianity fit into that? Does it encourage and support or even help prepare them for this transition? So I like this picture for a number of reasons. It doesn't show everything. There's also issues to do with kind of shifts in local politics, church-state relations within the context of an overbearing and sometimes oppressive Vietnamese state. And it also, because we're inside the church, we don't get to see the rural landscape and kind of agricultural livelihoods, which is a million miles away from central London where we are now. And so after our panel discussion, I'm going to be screening a bit of an ethnographic documentary with the author, the filmmaker Harvey Buniga's permission, where you can hopefully get a kind of snapshot of that. But the picture doesn't say everything, and that's why you've got to all read the book. So that's all I've got to say, but thank you again.
Okay, we're going to move on to Emma Tomalin. Professor Emma Tomalin is a professor of religion and public life at the University of Leeds. She's a sociologist of religion whose work is focused on the broad area of religion and public life. She has a long-standing interest in religions and global development, including the gender dimensions of this relationship. She's the author of many books, including the very intriguingly titled Biodivinity and Biodiversity, which was published in 2009, and Religion and Development, 2013. She's also edited not one but two Routledge handbooks, the Routledge Handbook of Religions and Global Development in 2015, and more recently the Routledge Handbook of Religion, Gender and Society. Emma, thank you very much for being here this evening. Looking forward to your thoughts.
Thank you very much. So, Seb, thanks for inviting me to say a few words about your amazing book. We've connected on a number of occasions over the past years while you've been working on the book, and I've heard you present parts of it several times at different conferences and workshops. And I must say it's an absolute joy to see that the book's been published, and I want to congratulate you on a very fine and original piece of scholarship that will no doubt have a large impact. I was very impressed. I mean, not surprised, but very impressed. A particular strength of the book, as Lars pointed out also in his introduction, is its ability to present a very detailed and nuanced study of religious, social and economic change among Hmong communities, but then with reference to a multidimensional and interdisciplinary framing that engages with an impressively broad range of theoretical frameworks and empirical data from different settings. And in fact, it's actually very difficult to pinpoint what is likely to be its main academic impact, given its attention to and contribution to scholarship across disciplinary areas, including political economy, to development studies, and the sociology of religion. And as Lars pointed out in my introduction, I primarily come to this book with a background in the study of religion and international development, and I've read Seb's book through this lens. So the book presents a micro-study of the Hmong community in the Vietnam highlands that draws upon ethnographic fieldwork carried out over visits spanning several years to specifically better understand the distinctive role that conversion to Christianity in the context of competing development alternatives has played. So from compliance with state-led communist framings to neoliberal development trajectories, we get to see Christianity in combination with these diverse routes to development. And while the book's multi-dimensional and interdisciplinary, it does adopt an overall framing in terms of the concept of everyday political economy, and I thought that worked extremely well. It was very effective. So I've got a couple of areas that I'm hoping you might be able to elaborate on. So to come to the first area that perhaps you could elaborate on in a bit more detail, you tell us in your book that researchers of religion and development would benefit from the insights of everyday political economy to broaden the scope of inquiry into the political and economic dynamics of religious activity in context of poverty and inequality. And I totally agree with this, but I wanted to flip it round. And I wondered if you could also tell us about the ways in which you think EPE could benefit from the study of religion and spirituality, particularly where political economy and related approaches have tended to overlook the contribution of faith-related issues. So I'll give my introduction, then we can come back to have some discussion. So the second area that I want to briefly address is one area where I think this book does make a particular contribution and impact, and namely that's with respect to what many of us are calling the local term within the study of religions and development. So religions and development is a field that's been emerging over the past couple of decades, and it began by very much focusing on establishing the relevance of religion for development studies from a situation where it had pretty much been ignored given the secular underpinning of development studies as well as development practice. I'm talking about the global, international level. So this need to prove the relevance of religion for development typically led to a focus in this literature on what we might call the comparative advantage of faith-based approaches to development in ways that I find to be rather reductionist and essentialist, and speaking to an international audience in very general terms, but not really reflecting the experiences of local faith communities. And over the recent years, there's been very much a call to focus more strongly on local faith actors and their role in development, to capture the nuance and complexity of faith for development in ways that cannot be easily articulated in terms of a binary between good and bad. And your book does this really, really well. So I was really struck by your emphasis in particular on the fact that there are different paths to development, and particularly the study of the three Hmong communities that had engaged differently with religion and with different development opportunities in order to establish a distinctive path to improving their lives. So we're not talking about a particular country having a distinctive path, but communities within communities within communities, which really, really struck me within your book. So this leads me to the second thing that I'd like to hear a bit more about. So considering the evidence that the book offers about the importance of understanding local routes towards modernity or towards development, what would you say are the implications of this for international development policy and practice? So for instance, how can the findings from your book play into international strategies to achieve the SDGs, or conversations that are beginning to happen about what the post-2030, post-SDG agenda might look like? Why are we doing this research? What kind of transformations do we want this to achieve? And the final area that I wanted to reflect on, and perhaps this is kind of moving forward towards things that you would look at in the future rather than you've had the time to do so far. The final area I wanted to reflect on is with respect to your observations about gender. I was particularly interested in the chapter on gender and the way that you discussed how women were not only leading conversion in family, but were doing this to some degree because of the advantages to them and to the family more broadly. So, for instance, I was very struck by the constant thread of alcohol and of Christianity playing a strong role in encouraging or demanding or obliging men to stop drinking, and also the avoidance of expensive traditional customs and rituals. But you also stressed that conversion is not always a win-win situation for women, and that they're engaging in this kind of patriarchal bargain. I love this concept, which also required conformity and compliance and could act against their interests and their well-being. So, for instance, you write, at a wedding I attended, the pastor preached that God created the man first and then the woman, and that husbands should love their wives as Jesus loves the church, and that wives should listen to their husbands as believers listen, or to obey Jesus. And you touch a little bit about how this compliance to patriarchal Christian norms is beginning to be challenged by women, and men presumably as well, so particularly those who are studying theology, going to Bible classes outside of the community, and are being exposed to, I suppose, international global discourses of feminist theology. And you write that in time, perhaps this could develop into a broader critique of patriarchy within the church and beyond. So I don't know if you want to reflect a little bit on that, or perhaps talk a bit about how you might follow that up in the future, because I know this came at the end of the book, but I'm very interested to hear more about that. Have I used my time? Finally, I just wanted to sort of, and you touched upon this as well, really touch upon some quick observations about the methodology. I was really struck at how sort of respectful and ethical you were in conducting your research. You clearly had developed an excellent relationship with your participants that really added to the quality of the data, but also, it was very ethically presented, and I was extremely impressed by that. It showed great sensitivity to difficult and sensitive topics, and you're very much to be congratulated on that. So I'll leave it at that, and pass over to Maya. Thank you.
I'll start with your questions, Emma. So the first one being around, what could political economy or everyday political economy learn from the study of religion and spirituality, given that I kind of ventured to claim that religion and spiritual studies could learn something from everyday political economy. So, when I did my PhD, I was based in the Department of Politics and International Studies, and that was always kind of my way in. And in a sense, although I take religion very seriously, I still think at the end of the day it is quite a materialist approach, in that I'm really looking at the political and economic impact of changes in religious and spiritual behaviour. And that only goes so far. There's so much more that you could research about religion in terms of identity, how people are actually interpreting this, subjective experiences of the divine. I don't really go into that. That's probably a limitation of my study for sure. However, materialist approaches don't have to just, they don't all just dismiss religion as kind of false consciousness, or even you don't have to fall into an instrumentalist approach. You can still, and especially I find in Southeast Asian studies, there's quite a few good studies out there that, because spirituality is very deeply ingrained in a lot of everyday life in Southeast Asia, you can't really, or you can ignore it, but it's not a good idea if you want to understand what's going on. So I think political economists or everyday political economists or whatever could benefit from taking religion seriously by starting with, trying to understand how people explain their own situation, their own behaviour, and their own kind of, perspectives from their own explanations, which, often have an element of religious or spiritual. Sometimes that's the cause of. That's the kind of fundamental thing that is, showing how they interpret everything in life. But sometimes it's just a part of it, and it mixes with other rationalities. And so, I think hopefully some of us political economists have moved beyond the days of just overlooking or ignoring religion. And I think some anthropologists have done this really well. And Ruth Marshall's book on political spirituality in Nigeria, I think that's excellent. I think the contribution of some of the religion and spirituality studies, like Linda Woodhead's work on everyday religion and how different it can be from like the religious orthodoxy, would be really helpful for political economists to kind of get a better starting point from which to kind of move on to our bigger, how does this fit in with kind of global structures of economic inequality and everything. I do want to connect it to that, but if you don't start from how people understand it themselves, you're going to end up going in a weird direction which doesn't make sense to what people are actually experiencing. So I think that's what I would kind of answer to that. And then in terms of the question about how does my book, or what kind of lessons could be learned on that for the kind of broader international development agenda, which we all hear about, the Sustainable Development Goals and all of this. My book again. International development practitioners don't really play a major role in the conversation. It's the main, the focus is on Hmong communities, religious practitioners. There are international Christian denominations and networks getting involved, but they wouldn't see themselves as development practitioners in the traditional sense, although some of what they do in terms of information sharing and connecting and networking, could arguably be seen through the lens of development. And then the other kind of main actor is the Vietnamese state, which does have a very kind of development agenda and is sometimes funded by international, or is often projects are funded by the World Bank or big NGOs, but it always has to be funded through the state. So if you're kind of looking inside this box of development, then one size doesn't fit all. That's a problem that the Vietnamese government often kind of impose their ideas of what development should look like on ethnic minorities, and then no one really engages with it because it doesn't make sense, or it hasn't been even just translated into local languages, and it often comes across as kind of assimilation attempts, and that's a big problem. Whereas when these Hmong Christians from, say, the United States or Thailand come up and say, we really want to help you, then that comes across in a very different approach, and they believe and do everything that this Hmong Christian from Thailand tells them to do, whilst ignoring what the government tells them, even if it was fairly similar advice kind of thing. So how to, thinking about how to partner more effectively with grassroots agencies and kind of taking advantages of the existing network of trust and being aware of the other, political tensions and contestations would be part of it. I guess that's the kind of inside the box answer. If we want to kind of challenge the box, and then this is more my ideas, if I'm honest, rather than I'm not speaking on behalf of the Hmong community now. What I'm aware of is this, and I talk about in the book, is this kind of constant need to improve and move up the social hierarchy. In Vietnamese, it's called vươn lên, and it's like always need to go up, and this like the kind of mantra of international development that we need to progress, we need to move forward, and Christianity doesn't contradict this. In fact, in some ways, it kind of embraces this vision. But it's all the Hmong can never catch up with the ethnic King majority because of the kind of existing economic disadvantages and kind of marginal place that they're in. So this kind of mantra has problems because it's stuck in the kind of capitalist inequality that we live in. And so can we move beyond this kind of idea of development as a constant need to kind of generate more economic growth? Whatever happens to kind of quality of life? Does religious elements of well-being have something to say to that? So there's some ideas. It's not really I need to think about it properly before I write a policy briefing. But I'd like to hear your opinions on that as well. But I'll just quickly touch on Maya's questions. And in terms of, my book is focused on the kind of economic and kind of fairly narrow view of the political kind of impacts and dimensions of Christian conversion and religious transformation in Hmong communities. In terms of the kind of social levels, I mean, I would definitely recommend reading Tung Ngo's ethnography called The New Way, that kind of came out before my book, and that touches much more on the social element. I mean, social conflict is definitely part and parcel of this religious transformation. We've seen kind of big conflicts and kind of divides within communities of those who have converted and those who have not, and both sides have had a part to play in kind of stoking kind of religious polarization, as has kind of government intervention, which has often been kind of counterproductive and very heavy-handed. And on a macro level, you do kind of see this within the transnational Hmong community as well. And there's kind of similar debates happening in the United States, where Christian conversion was kind of not quite as dramatic thing, but it's having similar kind of tensions where the Christians see themselves, Christianity was originally translated into the Hmong language as the new way, vis-a-vis the old way, and so the old way was looked down on, and a lot of traditional elements of Hmong spirituality were just rejected or demonized, whilst the kind of those who didn't convert accused the Christians of losing their roots and betraying, and it got very messy. So interestingly, these things happened in America and Vietnam, but they weren't actually connected with each other when they were happening. It's only more recently that there's been more kind of communication and internet technologies facilitated that. So there's some interesting parallels, but I don't go into that in the book, but yeah, that's important. And then finally, in terms of methodology, yes, doing this kind of research in Vietnam requires a lot of kind of good relations with local academics who were very generous in supporting me and sometimes going out of their way to kind of help me get proposals through which, maybe are not really supposed to be the topic of critical research in Vietnam. And so even now, actually, since Nguyen Phu Trong has kind of taken over the government scene and has there's been a similar kind of anti-corruption purge as you've seen in China happen in Vietnam. No one wants to kind of step out of line or take a risk with some foreign researcher who's got a wacky idea. So my contacts in Hanoi said, if you came to us with your PhD proposal now, we wouldn't touch it with a barge pole. Back then, in 2015-16, there was a kind of window of opportunity, which I was kind of lucky enough to get in. And then in terms of like knowledge production and kind of co-producing knowledge, it was a really kind of important principle for my research. I did my PhD in 2016-17 was my field work, but this was really a part of an ongoing relationship with people and communities which had been started back in 2011 or so, and have continued afterwards. And this is not the only kind of output of our collaboration. We started a kind of grassroots development initiative on YouTube called Hmong, which was kind of sharing livelihoods advice in Hmong languages audiences, and this was like, again, this wasn't really my idea, but I could get some funding from my universities to kind of promote it, and so yeah. Although I've now shifted to a kind of different topic, I very much hope and plan that this is not the end of our kind of collaboration. So I think I'll leave it at that.
Can I just respond to the question that you asked me?
Yeah.
I asked you.
Yeah.
So the question was, how does Seb study? What lessons does it give for the international development community? How should they be doing things differently in the light of your study? And you emphasise very much how the Vietnamese state has this understanding of what development should look like and tries to impose that upon communities, and that's very much what the international aid business has tried to do over. Since the Second World War, has had a very fixed idea of what development and progress should look like, and for that to be the model that people in the global South should follow as well. International development actors have been talking about things like localisation, bottom-up development for a really long time now. Since the 1980s.
Exactly, but I didn't think I had anything new to say. But
they don't. But they take service to it. They talk about it. For instance, when they established the SDGs, there were wide-ranging consultations apparently held at the local level, bringing in different kinds of civil society groups and different interest groups to get their understandings of what the SDGs should look like. But when you look at the actual framework, it's still very top-heavy and very neoliberal and doesn't really allow much of that local voice. And I thought the example that you just gave there of the YouTube project, getting some funding to support local people in their local languages to share livelihood experience and advice is an absolutely perfect example of what development should look like, and perhaps no more than that, to be a facilitation and a support to existing successful practices, but without that blueprint for what it ought to look like or what the actual end goal ought to be. So, great example.
Hi, sorry I came in quite late. I've got stuck on my way across, so I missed the first speaker's presentation, I think. And I've not read your book, Seb, but I can't wait to read it. I was just wondering why you chose the highlands. I think I know why you chose the highlands region, but what would your study have looked like had you chosen a Christian group in another area? So I'm thinking about some new areas that I know you want to do research, you are doing research in, where you've got Christian groups, very strong Christian groups, which lead to a different kind of development, possibly through migration remittances. So could you say a little bit about that, about the chosen location, and what would how would your study look differently if you were looking at another group, perhaps in a rural area, deprived rural area, but not in the highlands area?
Should I respond to that? Yeah, thanks, Tamsin. Yeah, I think what I found very kind of convenient about my case study of Hmong Christian conversion was because it had happened in such a short time period, and there was this, there was not this kind of traditional, the normal story of Christianity in the global South, it came along when the colonial invaders brought along their priests and missionaries. That gave it this kind of unique factor and what I say in my book when I'm talking about I think it made it easier to identify what was uniquely kind of religious about this whole kind of political and economic dynamics. In that it was quite clear and it was quite obvious in a way that I think it's not so obvious. I think religion is always an important facet for people who believe it in whatever their situation is, but it's not always easy to kind of separate from all the rest of the things that are going on in everyday life. So, for example, let's talk about the Vietnamese Catholic community in central Vietnam, where now Tamsin and I are both doing research about out-migration from this area, north-central Vietnam, and I think huge, or not huge, but significant Catholic portions. And how could I think I can still apply, and I'm trying to continue to use my everyday political economy ideas in my more recent work. but I think it's a lot kind of more fuzzy and muddled, where like, are the Catholics acting any different to the non-Catholics? And, you know, if so, is that because of kind of religious motivations, or is it because they've kind of formed these long-term religious networks of communities which have formed over generations? And so that's why I think I chose my study, because it was such a dramatic and quite kind of unique, not like, there was a relative absence of other kind of factors to explain the situation. So yeah, I'm not quite sure. I think it would be a lot more difficult to apply it in other situations.
Really interested to hear about your work, and I'm really looking forward to reading it. I'm a PhD student, so it'll be interesting to see how you approached the study. I guess I'm quite interested in there's a lot of talk about like development and development regimes and the way sort of you've sort of introduced the book. A lot of that goes alongside environmental change and kind of visions of the way the landscape changes. So is there something you found related to kind of the way people were using landscape kind of as an agrarian community, and the way the sort of environmental change was experienced with these communities in your research through sort of religious transformation?
Yeah.
Take the questions.
Yeah, thank you, Seb, and congratulations. This is a very challenging topic, and you have made it, and huge congratulations. And first, a comment, and following your discussion on SDG and post-SDG agenda, and definitely this book also work can inform very well the post-2030 agenda, because religion is really missing in the current SDG agenda. So your work can inform the post-agenda very well. You think differently, you think more in a more nuanced way about the role of religion, or the everyday religion in the development agenda. And so my follow-up questions continue the discussion about co-construction of knowledge. Can you elaborate a little bit more on how equitable this process has been done? How have you implemented co-construction of knowledge? How you think about the local research participants in this equitable co-production or co-construction of knowledge in the research?
Great, thanks. Yeah. Okay, I'll start with. Should we do those questions? Yeah. We'll come back. Thanks. Yeah. So I'll start with your question about like where's the environment in this? Right. So my second or third chapter, I think it's good. Let me just check, because there's slightly different order to my second chapter. PhD. I look at the kind of the dynamics of changing livelihoods. So this whole region is becoming kind of the site of market expansion. So people who were previously farming, often primarily farming rice to feed their own family, and then any extra, there's always been trade and market trade and stuff. But what's now happening is that these areas are kind of being integrated into the national market economy, where people are encouraged to cash crop and produce exclusively or mainly for market sale, and then buy your needs and wants after that. And so this is a big transition, and it is accompanied with changing attitudes towards the land and the environment, for sure. So one kind of issue that came up quite a lot was kind of population increase, not just, including like just natural or local population increase, but as well migration into the northern highlands from lowlanders, which has kind of an ethnic dimension, because lowlanders majority ethnic King, Vietnamese majority, and so they there was that kind of marginalisation going on, where in this kind of research community that I was based, all of the kind of companies that were making a kind of huge profit were like these salmon farmers who were fish farming, and they were all ethnic king, non-locals. They'd come in and they were kind of making big profits, and everyone else was just kind of carrying on and struggling to get by. But they weren't all just in that. Some of them were trying to innovate. So, if I'm honest again, it wasn't really the forefront of my questions. There was complaint about overcrowding. You couldn't just let your kind of buffalo roam free anymore, wander into a road and get shit or something, or the land, there's not enough land anymore, it's all been bought up or divided up. Increasing use of fertilizers and vaccines for animals, because there was lots of kind of diseases going around. These were all kind of happening. They weren't something that people were kind of particularly like panicking about, really. But I think, I kind of wanted, that was another thing that I wanted to kind of go back and look at. Climate change was definitely happening. There was like these freak snowstorms or, bad weather and stuff that was ruining people's crops and everything. So it does kind of, it's in the background somewhere, but it's not something that I focus on. Did you want to say something?
I was going to add something. It's a really interesting question. And I think sometimes in the literature, conversion to Christianity is seen as accompanying a kind of lessening of respect for nature, in the sense that it often then replaces, indigenous or traditional beliefs that people held when they were much more interconnected with their livelihoods, with natural processes and so on. So that could be a way in which, the conversion to Christianity could actually be seen.
Yeah.
Losing that connection to. We shouldn't romanticise this.
No, I see. I've heard that debate.
I'm just wondering how that fits with your question and also your research.
Yeah, sure.
I think in a related way, something that sort of is not necessarily my research area particularly, but it's very interesting where the landscape environment is changing and how diverse the responses of people are and how embedded in cultural context it can be, the way that people kind of express that it's hot to them. They remember it when they were a kid and stuff, so there's quite a, it feels like there's a lot of overlap in some way.
Yeah, the kind of, at the risk of generalising, what I've read about of kind of traditional Hmong attitudes towards land was not particularly kind of connected and, embedded as you might see in other kind of traditional animistic practices. So the Hmong traditionally have quite a kind of fast and loose attitude towards the environment, where they'll be in one area and practice shifting cultivation, burn the forest down, farm for a bit, and then, it's sustainable in a small area, but then often they would just get up and leave and migrate 100 miles to a different part of the world, and there was very little attachment to a particular space. So maybe that might account for, I didn't really see that much attention or care for the environment on either Christian or non-Christian side of the community. That was my impression, but because I wasn't really focusing on that, I can't really say for sure. And then, so back to your question, Hannah, asking a little bit more about how the knowledge was produced, right? And what was the role of local people in that?
Yeah, how the co-construction of knowledge is equitable.
Equitable, yeah. Yeah, I struggle with this because I kind of think, so doing research in Vietnam, there was certain limitations and restrictions that I kind of had to follow when I'm on my official research visa. So I have a certain kind of limited time period to do the research. I had to be accompanied by an official research assistant. Luckily, I managed to get a local Hmong research assistant who also worked for the local authorities, which kind of presents its own problems, but at least they could interpret for me, because I can speak Vietnamese but not Hmong. So there was like the older generation of Hmong people don't speak much Vietnamese, or a lot of them I had to use an interpreter for, whereas the young generation was almost always in Vietnamese. Like I definitely sometimes, and it was quite intensive. Like we were doing sometimes like 5 or 6, or even like I think 8 interviews in one day. Like it was crazy. We get proper burnout going from one village to the next. And certain times of it, I did feel like I am just kind of extracting information here, and I want to be honest about that. I think that was kind of partly what drove me to kind of not end with the kind of data generation, but to carry on with the kind of further collaboration of like kind of informal development conversations and grassroots connections and support. And so on one level, I felt like that extra thing was kind of giving something back, and I used to hate that phrase, giving something back, because it kind of implies that you've taken a lot more and then you give a little bit back. But it kind of is true on certain levels. And so I think, whenever I finish an interview, and I'd ask, do you have any questions for me? And some people would be interested in, what life was like in the UK and everything. And then a lot of people would ask, how is this research going to help us? And I was like, okay, that's really important. And so that kind of spurred me towards this kind of Hmong organisation, but also like making the information available to first of all, like in Vietnamese. I've written stuff in Vietnamese. I present in Vietnam because I think it's very arrogant to kind of say this is what's happening in Vietnam and not get anyone to fact check it, at least from what's happening from Vietnam. So I'm doing my best to kind of distribute the knowledge to the research community. But yeah, there's still some tensions there for sure.
Got a question in the back.
Yeah, my name is Hong, and final year PhD candidate in SOAS, and doing China Myanmar borders, and I actually got through quickly your book. It's just the subtitles, and I found there's so many concepts I can use as well, and I feel like my question is like how you define Southeast Asian studies. Like, have you had the kind of like difficulties when people ask you what the discipline you are? And then I found myself, I'm in the politics department, by using the historical approach. So I'm not sure, am I really a politics person or a historical person? And I checked your background for anthropologist, but this book is not very anthropologist styled. It seems like it covers development studies, politics.
It's a mess.
I mean, it's very useful and very helpful for me too. There are lots of concepts I learned and take away. So I feel like in the stage, any advice for PhD, and just like how you define yourself like in specific disciplines or areas.
Yeah, sure. I definitely had a similar problem when I was trying to write this up, and it was like, this chapter I want to use this theory from this discipline, but this chapter I want to use a completely different theory from a completely different discipline, like go from anthropology to sociology, really. And my supervisor, who did a great job of trying to keep me on the straight and narrow, said, you've got to look for that kind of red line that can somehow go through the whole from start to finish, and something that can kind of draw it together. And for me, I found everyday political economy was that kind of tool that helped me to draw some fairly kind of diverse and sometimes eclectic different kind of theoretical contributions here and there and everything. So yeah, I mean, I still don't really know how to define myself at this stage, apart from interdisciplinary. And so far, that's not been a problem. So don't worry about that. But for your actual PhD, you need that kind of something to make it kind of start and finish in the same place. And so that's my kind of recommendation, is to look for that and then and things like, I don't know, yeah, there's certain kind of flexibility you can have, like you can make kind of diverse connections, and I think it makes it more interesting to read, even if it's a bit kind of jumping here and there.
Thank you.
Yes, congratulations on the book. I mean, we have the same supervisor, so so I understand your approach, which is feminist political economy, the everyday, and so on, and you foreground intersecting identities when you talk about religious conversions and so on. I'm just wondering if you can comment a bit more about like whether if you see any generational difference when you talk about generational difference when you talk about religious conversion. So when you talk about gender, for example, whether there's a difference between older women and younger women and how that plays out in family dynamics and so on. So that's one question. And the second one is really about the work of James Scott in Upper Highlands as well. Like, where do you see yourself converge and diverge with James Scott in his work?
Yeah, great. I mean, so thanks for your questions, Chris. Yeah, like, yeah, and I don't know if you wanted to say anything to that kind of generational question, because I'm sure you get a lot of that in your work. Oh, okay. But yeah, absolutely. You see kind of different generational dynamics at play. Often the kind of older generation who were the ones who listened to the radio and they converted. They had that kind of conversion experience. Very overwhelming majority kind of unschooled, didn't go have a kind of formal education, and so there's these oral processes of dissemination. Although a lot of them then subsequently taught themselves how to read because they were told it was so important to read this Bible. So there's an interesting kind of connection between Christianity and literacy that I've written another paper about. And then the next generation, you get a big difference between the generation of people who were born into Christian families and then grew up in, say, a village where there was like, basically the whole village had converted, except for the one village elder who's employed by the local authorities, who gets a part-time salary, and they're not allowed to convert. So, and they're like, it's the only house with the Vietnam flag on the top of the roof. So, but often these younger generation of Christians, they actually don't know any Hmong non-Christians. They don't really have any friends from that, and that's quite sad. It's a problem because there's a lot of misunderstanding or misconceptions, and the same goes the other way. Sometimes with non-Christian communities who have these kind of don't have. So that's a kind of. Whereas the older generation, they all know each other, or even though they converted and maybe it caused some trouble in the family, they still know what it was like and what it is like and what other Hmong people think and everything. So once you get to that younger generation, then you get, for example, the younger generation are much more aware or concerned about who's a real Christian and who's just a Christian by name or doesn't really calls themselves a Christian but doesn't go to church or do any of the things. Whereas that distinction wasn't important or wasn't made by the older generation who they weren't really interested in that. So you see these interesting kind of generational features. And then, okay, so for those of you who don't know James Scott, he's a famous kind of, or infamous academic who has written a lot about everyday politics and the ideas of kind of small-scale resistance being a kind of very normal feature of society, and then looks into kind of Southeast Asian highlands as a kind of exemplar showing of how these people have kind of stayed or tried to keep the kind of state at arm's length by living in these remote areas or refusing to embrace like the majority identity or cultural religious practices sometimes. And I think The Art of Not Being Governed is a book. It's a good book to think with. In that I like and sometimes use some of the kind of concepts and ideas around it. I mean, the historians don't like it at all because it's full of these generalizations and cherry-picking examples. So I think I'm happy to be kind of vaguely associated with the Scottian school of thought, but I think I'm not limited by that. I think the work of Tanya Murray Lee is really good for kind of moving forward and moving beyond this kind of binary of resistance and compliance, and looking at how people are kind of not just kind of agreeing or rejecting kind of these external forces, but they're also being subjectified or subjectivized and conditioned into different ways of thinking, which is, is not so kind of clear whether it's resistance or compliance or whatever. So yeah, I'm in that debate somewhere.
I've got a question for you, Seb, which is, could you speak a little bit to how this work relates to the project that you did both with the ISRF and then are continuing to work on now and expanding as well? Maybe say a little bit about what you're doing for that project, but also what I'm particularly interested in is how some of these themes come back. Your focus on the political economy, but also questions of gender and questions of religion, and if these are playable.
Yeah, thank you. So since 2020, at that point I was actually in the process of applying for a kind of follow-on project to this work and heading back to the highlands, and then there was the COVID pandemic and that all got shut off, and so then I started looking to what research I could do here in the UK, and I started getting to know kind of Vietnamese transnational migrants who have come here, sometimes refugees, often labour migrants working in the nail salon industry. So it's quite different. The only real kind of common thread is that we're speaking Vietnamese still. But yeah, I absolutely think that the kind of concepts that I'm developing in this book can be, and if it can't be applied to different situations, it's not a theory, right? So theory has to be generalizable to some extent. And so when now I'm doing my new research, I'm looking for these the ways in which kind of local people, non-elites, in this case often like nail bar workers or sometimes cannabis farmers, it's hard for me to speak to those people, or at least they're not telling me about that, but it's definitely happening. So how are they dealing with these kind of external forces that are being applied to them? So in the case of Hmong, I identified the state as an obvious force and the market as another distinct force, which was kind of, they were both exerting different pressures on the community, and there was eliciting different responses. So whilst a lot of Hmong Christians would kind of would be provoked into resisting or rejecting state authority, at the same time you're quite happy to embrace the kind of incoming market economy. And so it wasn't like all resistance. That's what I'm glad that you spotted on the kind of multi-directional nature of this agency. It's not all in one way. And so now I'm looking at kind of what are the kind of pressures or forces that are conditioning or trying to kind of stamp their mark on Vietnamese labour migrants' lives here in the UK. And you've got, first of all, you've got this kind of hostile environment, migration regime that we live in, where migration is seen as a problem, and there's a lot of kind of police and council activities geared towards making it more hostile for migrants, and so that's one force. Then there's also these kind of transnational debt economies where people have borrowed huge amounts of money and now need to pay back. People usually back in Vietnam, and this is absolutely conditioning and influencing their decision making and their behaviour, and then you've also got the Vietnamese community itself, which is kind of multi-layered, and there's kind of different layers of kind of solidarity, but also exploitation happening. And so that's how I can hopefully, on one of these pages in the introduction, I have a little box of what everyday political economy would look like. Yeah. If you'd all like to turn to page 15, and then I've got this picture of what I think everyday political economy would look like. then I'd have to change all these words and these arrows, but maybe the central box I could keep the same. You've got gender, everyday elites, actor-centric and agency-centric. I can't be able to explain that now. But everything else from the outside and around is going to be looking different. So hopefully that'll help me.
So you mentioned the different forces coming from the state and coming from the market. So what I'm really curious about how the Hmong ethnic minority group think or perceive the majority, the king majority, and is any way to exercise that agency against the king majority. Any contestation?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, I think my kind of overall impression was that Hmong people, they certainly don't hate the ethnic majority or anything like that, or the state. They don't hate the state. Even those who have had kind of suffered very kind of brutal, I would say, religious persecution from government actors, they didn't kind of. It's hard to kind of express all your emotions, but they'd often laugh about it. But that's kind of a way of, diffusing the tension, maybe. But I think that the overall perception of the state, at least, was that there was this force which they might be able to get something from. It might be able to help them, but it might not, and they couldn't really trust. They'd have to take each kind of state development initiative one at a time and say, is this going to help us? No, I don't think so. Oh, this one would, though, so we'll embrace that, but we're going to ignore that. And it wasn't seen as something that was out for their good. It was something that they might be able to use for their good if they were smart and engaged with it. But overall, there was a very kind of ambivalent perception towards it. And then for kind of general ethnic king lowlanders, on one level there was there was a fascination about how obsessed with the economy they were. Like, there was this joke that was going around. So the Vietnamese word for their ethnic majority group is the king, and the word for business is King Zwang. And so they said the Vietnamese, they get their name from the word business. The king are there to land King Zwang, and they just see like these people who are just working every day a little bit to kind of sell one little thing from their corner shop, and they'll just keep on doing that. And there was certain kind of admiration for that, and some people wanted to follow that. And that's the kind of market-oriented development paradigm that was on offer for them. But they didn't want to kind of lose their own identity. There's a very strong sense of we're still Hmong, we still speak Hmong, and it was quite impressive that this ethnic identity has withstood a lot of kind of pressure to assimilate or ridicule over the years. So yeah, that's part of the answer. But you'll get more of the answer when you read the book.
Okay, I think we're going to leave it here.
Yeah.
Thank you everyone for really great questions and a great discussion. Please join me in thanking the panel as well.